Well, hello there, BookTube. It's time for a Scallydandle, and today's is to Kazakhstan with an author called Mukhamet Shayakhmetov. Here's the book, The Silent Steppe. The kind of subtitle for the book is The Story of a Kazakh Nomad Under Stalin. And Shayakhmetov wrote it it was published in Kazakhstan in 2002, and then this translation came out in 2006. It was translated by Jan Butler, and it is, as it says, a memoir that covers the period of Shayakhmetov's youth. So from the time that he was born in 1922 up till sort of towards the end of World War II. So it's the 1920s and 30s, which was a period of the most dramatic change in his homeland of Kazakhstan. Dramatic, in many ways disastrous. It was a period when about a quarter of the Kazakh population disappeared, died, or fled in some numbers to China and places to the south. So very significant period in Kazakh history, and he wrote about it as an old man, looking back to his childhood and youth. Now, Kazakhstan is a vast and relatively sparsely populated country. We probably sort of in our heads know it best as the former Soviet Republic. And usually at this point in my Scallydandling videos, I show you on my trusty globe where the country in question is that I'm describing. Well, now, unfortunately, because this is an oldish globe, although, Kazakhstan is here, you can't see it really well, because at that stage when this globe was made, it was part of the Soviet Soviet Socialist Republic, USSR. But if you imagine that it goes from the Caspian Sea in the west sort of across to the Altai and Tian Shan Mountains in the east. And to make it a little bit clearer for people who are not terribly well versed in the geography of Central Asia, here's the map in the book. That's present-day Kazakhstan, and if you can see, you've basically got Russia sort of all the way to the western north above it, China to the east. It doesn't actually have a direct border with Mongolia, although Mongolia is close, and then underneath you've got Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. So that kind of places it for you, but this hardly gives you a sense of how huge it is. Kazakhstan is same sort of size as India. It's often compared with sort of the size of Western Europe, the western part of Europe. So, huge place. Now, with a really, really interesting history, illustrated by the fact that Kazakhstan, the present day country, has technically only existed for sort of 30 years, since 1991. But in 2015, they celebrated the 550th anniversary of Kazakhstan as a country. So how old it is as a place depends on how you look at it. The Central Asian steppes and that area was traditionally been one of nomadic pastoralists. So people, who kept herds of livestock and moved between summer and winter pastures, and since time immemorial, really. And interestingly, it's the area where the horse was first domesticated, as far as we know. It's passed through the hands of various sort of empires over time. The Scythians, for example, around sort of 1st century BC, that sort of time. It was part of the Empire of Genghis Khan, the huge Mongol Empire, and then was under the Golden Horde, and so it became a sort of Turkic Khanate area. It's around the 15th, 16th century, I guess you would say, that something distinctively Kazakh emerged in that area in terms of language and culture and identity. And the Kazakh Khanate sort of ruled it from then onwards. So you could imagine, Khans at times might have controlled the whole of the area of more or less what would modern day Kazakhstan, sometimes a wider area, sometimes that was subdivided, and you might have had, 3 different Khans, so it varied, but, essentially an identifiable Kazakh place with predominantly, well, almost exclusively nomadic population, but strong, loyalties and political and economic system. But in the 19th century, or end of the 18th and into the 19th century, the Russians to the north and west, really start to move in on Central Asia. Interestingly, at the same time as the British Empire was kind of moving up from India, and you've got the Russians moving down from Russia, and places in between are kind of squeezed out and taken over. The Kazakhs certainly resisted that. That was by no means a sort of straightforward process, and the Russians sort of looked to move Russian colonists there to settle and sort of create control. And by the mid-19th century, basically the area that's now Kazakhstan was part of the Russian Empire. At the same time, there was a really strong Kazakh nationalist movement, and literature was an interesting part of that. So there's a long history of Kazakh oral literature, particularly poetry. Being a bard was a Kazakh profession. You could instead of being keeping livestock, you could be a bard. Like a traveling poet, storyteller, musician. But in the late 19th and very early 20th century, those things first start getting recorded in written form, and people like Abaykun and Bauli, take a key role in trying to kind of capture Kazakh culture, Kazakh's folk literature, and preserve that. Then, of course, early 20th century, First World War, collapse of the Tsarist Russian Empire, a little bit of chaos. Kazakhs briefly autonomous at that point, but then falls under the Soviet socialist rule. Communist Russia takes control, and so by 1920, that's where we are, and that's the point when our author, Shayakhmetov, was born. So he was born in 1922, and born into a family of traditional Kazakh nomads, because that was how Kazakhstan worked. That's how people lived in Kazakhstan. Who they moved between well-established summer and winter territories and settlements, with traditional camping places in between. And the book starts with him describing that bit of his boyhood, his early boyhood, and it describes a life that is quite, tough in some ways, but rich and flourishing, successful, economically viable, quite idyllic for him as a boy, and like he says, the toughest thing in his life at that stage was when he had to look after the kid goats, and they're a bit unruly and tend to run off, and you get into trouble if you didn't keep all the kids, let quite any of the kid goats lost, whereas the lambs were much less tiresome. Right. Moving from place to place with family, with clan, very, warm, close-knit relationships, lots of song and festival. In summer they'd be living in yurts so they could move from place to place, all of that. And that's his boyhood. But in 1929, 28-29, the Soviet government basically decided that it was time to impose their policy of collectivization, of removing farming from individuals and creating kind of collective farms, state farms that where everything was shared, and labor was shared and livestock was shared and land was shared. So they wanted to impose that on these sort of nomadic pastoralist people. And doing that was problematic enough in areas of fixed settlement and agriculture, and in other parts of the Soviet Union. But doing it in an area that's traditionally nomadic was disastrous. Nomadic peoples have always lost out in history as borders have become fixed, and I've often found their traditional areas that they move between, might be in two different countries that at that point mean nothing to them, and that has happened again and again all around the world, different parts of the world. But and their roots being cut off, and finding land that they had always spent part of the year on now supposedly belongs to someone else who's settled there, so very problematic. And modern society just struggles with people that move, doesn't it? You see that in the UK today, where we further and further criminalise the traveller community. So the Soviet Union was not alone in disadvantaging traditionally nomadic societies, I guess. But collectivizing agriculture was truly disastrous for the Kazakhs and Kazakhstan. They brought to Kazakhstan this concept of the kulak, the rich landowning peasant. But people didn't own land; what they owned was livestock. So the sort of the owners of larger herds were identified as kulaks and persecuted. And this is what happened to Shayakhmetov's family. His uncle and then his father were labelled as kulaks there. Livestock was seized, they were imprisoned. That meant that he, as a kulak's son, was expelled from school, became someone that friends and other clan members and family and extended it was illegal for them to help them, and this story basically describes how his father's been imprisoned and his mother and he struggled to survive in a situation where there was famine across Kazakhstan, but they were particularly disadvantaged because they weren't even allowed to be part of a collective farm, even though the collective farms were themselves failing. What an interesting story to read. As a memoir, it covers such interesting territory. He does survive, obviously, or he wouldn't have got to write this memoir. And the memoir, sees him through the 20s and 30s and to the beginning of the Second World War, and he joins up and he spends some time in the defense of Stalingrad, for example, and that kind of brings the book to a close. And but we also are told what happened in his life beyond that. He's injured, he comes home, he ultimately succeeds in completing his education. He becomes a teacher and a head teacher and a sort of educational administrator for his area. So he actually ends up having quite a successful life under the Soviet system, and a wife and a family, and finds, I suppose, happiness and rewards. He also lives to see the fall of communism and the formation of modern day Kazakhstan in the 1990s, and he's writing this book in, say, the early 21st century. when Kazakhstan has become, in many ways a very successful country, but also one with sort of very authoritarian regime and, significant human rights abuses. And he alludes, I suppose, to that quite delicately in the story because, he's still living there. And so it's, he's seen, such change in his lifetime, hasn't he? And that's one of the key strengths of the book, I guess, his perspective. So let's talk about the strengths of the book as something to read, as opposed to, the fascinating history. Well, obviously, the fascinating history is one of the key strengths of the book. Now, it's not, I would say, it's not a work of history. It's memoir. I wouldn't want you to. You shouldn't come to this book expecting sort of great literary pretensions, but equally it's not, some old chap's ramblings about his, half memories of, 80 years before, by any means. This is a well-constructed book. It's got enough of the political, social and historical context for you to understand what's going on. You're seeing it through the eyes of a child, the key years that he's writing about. So there's something very vivid about that. And the way that children just sort of just get on with things and see things as they are, but don't perhaps overanalyze them. He kind of brings that sensibility to how he writes. It's well constructed. I think an element of that kind of well-structured nature of the book is that there was an editor and called Anthony Gardner, and I think that he probably should take some of the credit to that. I don't know that he worked with Shayakhmetov and the translator Jan Butler to sort of help make the book one that would work for an English reading audience. It is packed with dramatic events, obviously. There's lots of action, shall we say, in this story. Action, literally, and sort of emotional action, I guess. It's but he brings quite a balanced perspective and attitude to the book, I guess. It's like the view of an old man who's really seen a lot and lived through a lot and has seen human nature over his lifetime, and he understands why people did terrible things, including terrible things to him and his mother and his father. He's amazingly not bitter, I guess, in the way he writes about his experiences. He, in many ways, he focuses on moments of kindness and moments of generosity, and he recognizes, that he was lucky to survive, but also that was very much down to his mother's determination and some lucky breaks when people did help him out or go out on a limb for him. So, although it's full of tragedy, it's not a book that wallows in that in any way, and it's a book, I suppose, about cruelty and genocide of a kind, but it's also a book about, I don't know, human resilience. It's certainly something that I would recommend if you are interested in that part of the world, that history, and also interested in kind of human beings and how they live through disasters. So there we go. That was my first book by an author from Kazakhstan. I hope I'll read more. I'd like to find a novel next. I've got a possible one in mind, and if you've got any recommendations, I'd love to hear those too. Or if you've read this.